In the closing months of 1944, on the western front of Germany, the sky was always a shade of grey, like cloth boiled and washed too many times, stripped of lustre and even of weight. Anneliese Hofmann was only 18 then, yet she could already tell, with practiced ease, the type of wound each casualty carried just by the mingled smells of strong disinfectant and blood. She knew which ones could still be saved, and which were only holding on for a few more breaths. The war had pushed her from being a vineyard worker's daughter into the corridors of a field hospital, and the hospital's fate was tightly bound to the collapse of the front lines. The shortage of supplies was grotesque. Bandages had run out back in summer, replaced by torn-up bedsheets, tablecloths cut into strips, old sackcloth scrounged from nearby villages. The fabric was boiled again and again, dried and reused, each time becoming thinner, more brittle, like an exhaustion that stretched out from the far end of the war. She was not afraid of blood. What truly frightened her was watching the pile of cloth grow smaller and smaller while new supplies never appeared. She knew every bandage had long since been swallowed by the front lines. The doctors knew it, the nurses knew it, everyone knew it. Yet in that system no one would ever admit, there is nothing. They only said, hold on a little longer. The next convoy is on its way. But no convoy ever rolled into those muddy fields again. The war pushed every resource further forward and left all the outlying places to be decided by fate. Anneliese often washed those strips of cloth at night in cold water. She would plunge her hands into the basin and rub at the bloodstains until her fingertips turned purple from the chill. That was all she could do. She believed that as long as the strips could still be used, as long as they could be boiled one more time, dried one more time, tied one more time, then perhaps one more young soldier carried in on a stretcher might be saved. Faith in wartime was usually built this way, not grand, not fervent, held together only by tiny acts of persistence that kept its shape from collapsing. But by late winter, these acts of persistence began to turn rapidly absurd. The shell fire drew closer. The supply lines broke completely. The front was retreating faster than the hospital could inventory its stores. The doctors discussed evacuation, only to realize it was already too late. Large numbers of severely wounded men could not be moved, and those who could still walk had been forcibly sent by the army to more interior defensive positions. The hospital became an isolated island on the verge of collapse. For the first time, Anneliese realized that every washing, every folding, every repeated use of each strip of cloth was only prolonging a curve that was bound to sink downward. When the tracks of American armored vehicles crunched over the snow outside, she was in the middle of bandaging a soldier whose leg had been hit by a bullet, using a strip of cloth that had gone a tired shade of grey. The strip was as stiff as a board. She had to use real force to make it wrap around the wound. She heard someone shouting, "Surrender!" and heard people arguing, but she did not lift her head. Not until a companion patted her shoulder and said everyone had to go outside. She let go of the strip in her hands and looked at the soldier's pale face, and for the first time she thought, perhaps, somewhere else, he would have a more suitable bandage, but she did not know what kind of bandage that would be. She had never seen anything brand new. The surrender unfolded more quietly than she had imagined. American soldiers ordered them to raise their hands, and then gathered the wounded into a farmhouse, where army doctors were arranged to examine them. During the retreat, a plank had gouged a long gash along her left forearm, which she had only had time to wrap once around with a strip of cloth. Blood had already seeped through the weave. The Americans noticed, but did not treat it immediately, only told her to go through registration and be assigned a number. On the way to the rear, she kept tightening that strip of cloth, afraid it might slip off. She knew that if she lost it, there would be no second piece. American vehicles lined up in convoy, carrying this mixed group of prisoners, nurses, orderlies, auxiliary personnel, and wounded, toward a temporary holding station. There were no piles of rubble there, no roofs blown open by bombs, but a neat row of military tents, each guy line drawn taut as if measured. That kind of order made her feel both unfamiliar and uneasy. She smelled, for the first time, the truly strong and even scent of alcohol. It was a smell that made one dizzy, but also conjured an idea of a cleanliness she had never experienced. She did not dare approach, and only stood at the entrance watching American personnel unload wooden crates one after another. On the crates it said medical supplies. She did not know English, but she understood the symbols, crosses, numbers, batch codes, dates, everything marked as if some enormous system had calculated them precisely. She saw one of the crates opened, and roll after roll of snow-white bandage taken out, smooth and orderly, the edges as clean and sharp as if cut by a blade. Those bandages did not look real. Her heart tightened. Without doubt, they were only for American soldiers. She could not even imagine them being used on German prisoners, much less on herself. Her gaze, heavy as if it could not be lifted, fixed on those rolls of cloth, and she felt a strange shame. White did not belong to them. Sometimes, poverty makes people instinctively afraid of cleanliness. The Americans had them line up to enter the medical tent. Those who were severely wounded were treated first. She stood at the end of the line, gritting her teeth against the pain, unwilling to look like someone who needed help. She was afraid that if she did, she would be driven out or refuse treatment. She did not know that from the very beginning these fears were meaningless. The first time she stepped into the American field medical tent, her steps were as hesitant as if she were entering another world. Instruments lay on metal trays, catching the light in cold flashes. The doctor's gloves were spotless, and even the air carried the sharp tang of antiseptic solution evaporating. She clutched her arm tightly. The ragged strip of cloth stood out abruptly, like a fragment that history had already discarded. When her turn came, she almost wanted to hide her hand behind her back, but the army doctor had already gestured for her to sit down. He was a man in his 30s named John McCarthy, his voice calm, as if he were attending to something utterly ordinary. He glanced once at her arm wrapped in the old strip, said nothing, and simply took scissors to the outer layer. The cloth, hardened by dried blood, came away with a faint tacky sound. She flinched reflexively. In that moment, she saw him pick up a roll of bandage from the tray and set it lightly on the metal surface. It was a full roll of snow-white gauze with tightly woven edges and a texture so light and soft it seemed never to have touched blood or war. She held her breath. He began to unroll the bandage, his fingertips resting lightly on the gauze to let it run out smoothly. His movements were natural, without the slightest pause, as if this were the last thing in the world anyone needed to save. Her eyes did not blink, and her heartbeat slid into confusion. When McCarthy raised his head, ready to lay the first layer of bandage over her wound, Anneliese suddenly jerked her arm back as if burned. The movement was so quick it defied logic, and even she was startled by it. The doctor froze for a second, then realized her reaction came from fear, not pain. He did not scold her or force her, only stopped and spoke a short sentence in English, softly. She did not understand the words, but there was no hostility in his tone. She shook her head and pressed her lips together, as if that patch of white were more frightening than the wound itself. She was not refusing treatment. She was fleeing from a shame she could not name. Her gaze settled on that roll of bandage, as though it were an object that could never rightfully belong to her. That cleanliness symbolized a kind of dignity that had never been extended to her side of the war, and she was no longer sure she had the right to touch it. McCarthy noticed, not from anything she said, but from the way she tensed like a frightened animal. He slowed his movements and set the bandage back on the tray without moving closer, then said something even shorter and calmer, as if explaining a rule. After that, he pointed to the other side of the tent, where an American soldier had just been brought in with a shrapnel cut along his leg. The nurse quickly slit open his trouser leg, and the doctor took another roll of identical bandage from the side and used it without hesitation. Anneliese stared at that scene. The same spotless bandage, the same easy unrolling, the same practiced knot at the end. The American soldier clenched his teeth against the pain, but the bandage was laid on with precision and steadiness. In that moment, she realized that this was no luxury, no symbol reserved solely for the victors. It was simply material, as ordinary as breathing, as water, as bread, a minimum threshold that this system took for granted. Her world tilted quietly in that instant. She raised her arm again, this time very slowly, as if testing whether reality would permit it. McCarthy did not hurry to resume, only gently supported her elbow to keep her from tensing up in fear. When the bandage touched her skin, it was unnervingly soft, nothing like the rough strips that had scraped like sandpaper in her memory. At that moment she realized for the first time that pain was not the hardest thing to endure. What was hardest to endure was gentleness coming from an enemy. She did not cry, and she showed no sign of gratitude. She simply let the bandage be wrapped in silence. No documentary record could fully capture the subtle tremor in her thoughts, but from the way her rigid shoulders gradually loosened, it could be seen that the layers of white gauze around her arm were, in their own way, wrapping around her hostility and slowly unwinding it. When he was finished, the doctor set the leftover piece of bandage at the edge of the tray with a casual motion. It was no more than 2 fingers wide and a little over 10 centimeters long. According to American procedure, these still-clean fragments were normally kept by nurses for secondary uses, tying small cuts, securing cotton pads, training with samples. To her, it was an incomprehensible waste. She stared at that strip of cloth for a long time. She knew that in the German hospital, such a piece would be treasured like a small hoard, boiled at least once more, used once more, stretched for a few more days. Here, it was merely the natural byproduct of a process, set aside carelessly, light as if it weighed nothing at all. Some say the deepest rift in war is not carved by weapons, but by institutions. The bandage was white not because the enemy was kind, but because their supply system had never collapsed. That night she slept in a barracks that had been recounted and assigned by the Americans. The beds were aligned in straight rows, thin blankets laid over the boards, the lights dim yet cleaner than any place she had slept during the retreat. She raised her hand and looked at the neatly applied bandage, and a strange illusion rose in her chest. It felt as if she were no prisoner of war, but an ordinary patient in a hospital. The next morning she was assigned to the daily routines of the holding camp. Prisoners were required to perform light labor, moving supplies, cleaning, recording and translating, every procedure in accordance with the articles of the Geneva Convention. She was placed near the medical tents to help with menial tasks because of her experience in German hospitals. That role allowed her to see the bandages again, and this time she saw the entire chain. Crates were replenished every day. Each one bore numbers, batch codes and shipping dates, like proof that some mechanism was still turning. Nurses never hesitated when they reached for bandages. There was no trace of a saving mentality. Here, bandages were not a scarce resource, but merely one step in a medical protocol. Someone cut a finger, someone scraped a hand, someone's wound reopened. Cotton pads, iodine, gauze, bandages. Every item could be reached at once. She suddenly became aware of a harsh truth. The war she was trapped in was not a contest between two forces with equal conditions. It was a confrontation between an industrialized nation and a system that had already been burned hollow and was only postponing collapse. Some wars are not lost at the front lines, but in the factories. One day, while sorting waste behind the medical tent, she saw an American nurse toss a small bundle of unsoiled but unused bandage strips into the disposal bag. Her brow furrowed on instinct, the movement almost like a pang, but the nurse only glanced at her briefly, as if understanding her reaction, and did not change the procedure. "Contaminated materials have to be discarded," the nurse said lightly. Anneliese did not argue. She simply watched in silence as the bag was tied shut, as if seeing a set of values being sealed inside. For the first time, she understood that cleanliness itself was a resource. That night, lying on her bunk, she suddenly recalled herself washing those strips of cloth in cold water, recalled the wounded men gritting their teeth, waiting for the freshly scrubbed strips to dry. In those days, every strip of cloth was a life, every fiber carrying the weight of survival. Now her arm was wrapped in a brand new bandage, and those old strips had retreated far into the distance of memory. She closed her eyes, and in her mind the unrolled bandage rose up again, as clean as fresh snow and as cold as a hard truth. By the 3rd week, the rhythm of the holding camp no longer felt strange to her. She knew the layout inside each tent, knew where the medical chests were kept, knew the order in which American staff preferred to take notes, and she knew that although she was a prisoner, she had been given a post that did not require scrubbing floors or lifting heavy loads, helping sort medical waste, recording bandage usage, checking inventory at the nurse's direction. Her name was written on a wooden duty board, and that gave her a peculiar sense of stability. Prisoners were not meant to possess stability, and the security that stability brought was something she was not yet used to. Sometimes when the night wind blew, she could smell residue of gunpowder outside the tents, a reminder that the war still continued. Yet inside the camp, the dominant smells were medicine, soap, clean water. Those things that had once been far from her world now surrounded her like a hidden layer of protection. She could hardly name this feeling. It was neither trust nor gratitude, but a hesitant confusion. She could not read the order of this war, nor the logic behind this system. She only knew that the American supply trucks were always on time, the medical chests always full, and the bandages always new. At times she would stare at the dates stamped on the crates. Some were only a few days old, some from yesterday. It meant that even now, factories in the rear were steadily producing medical supplies, like a continuous line that did not stop no matter how intense the fighting became. She finally understood why the medical staff did not need to economize on bandages. In a system that does not run dry, thrift can itself become a danger. When resources are abundant, rules can be enforced. When rules can be enforced, human lives can be taken seriously. She slowly began to comprehend this divide. One morning, while helping Nurse Alice reorganize inventory, she saw a roll of bandage that had slipped to the edge of a crate. It was wound tight and smooth, without a single crease, as if no hand had ever touched it. Alice bent down casually to pick it up and set it back in the box. The gesture was offhand, yet to Anneliese it felt like a silent reminder that what she found too precious to lay a hand on was here, simply part of routine resupply. "So, that's why you never run out of bandages," she murmured, almost as if speaking to herself. Alice heard but gave no answer, only went on with her work. The nurses had learned to stay professional under pressure, to keep emotion at bay and explanations brief. Their every movement followed a practiced, steady rhythm. After working alongside them for some time, Anneliese unconsciously began to imitate that same cautious composure. That afternoon she was assigned to assist in changing the dressing for a lightly wounded American soldier. McCarthy did not make any special comment, merely pointed at her and told her to put on gloves. It was the first time she had been allowed to touch a wound on an American. She hesitated slightly, then still pulled on the gloves and stepped to his side. The soldier had a shallow cut along the outer side of his leg, as if scraped by a metal edge. The wound was not serious, but it needed daily disinfection. McCarthy removed the old bandage and handed her a piece of clean gauze, indicating where she should press down around the wound. She did as instructed. Her hand was steady. That steadiness had been trained by long months in the German hospital. The soldier seemed to sense it and gave a soft, like a small sigh of relief. Then McCarthy placed a new roll of bandage into her hand. She froze for a moment. It was not out of fear, nor out of refusal, but because of a contrast she could not fully explain. This was the first time she held such an object not as someone being helped, but as someone giving help. She lowered her head and looked at the bandage unfolding in her palm. It was light, clean, soft, with a texture that still felt almost foreign. Carefully she unrolled the first length, slow but precise in her movements. McCarthy did not take over, nor did he correct her. He simply stood to one side, watching. With that roll of white gauze, she bandaged an enemy soldier for the first time. It was a scene she had never imagined. She had once stood on the other side, wrapping dressings around soldiers just as young, just as afraid, just as desperate to live, in a German hospital. Now her hands worked over a body in a different uniform, and yet what she was doing felt almost exactly the same. The moment the wound was covered, she understood something. Uniforms decide the war, but they cannot decide pain. She pressed down the final fold and secured the bandage firmly. The soldier murmured a brief, "Thank you." She understood those two syllables, but did not know how to reply, so she merely nodded. As she left the tent, she saw on the ground a small, unrolled piece of bandage. It was the leftover strip that had come off naturally during wrapping. Her steps faltered. That strip was only half a hand long, clean, intact, without any real use. McCarthy casually picked it up and dropped it into the collection tray. To her, it was still something that should be cherished. To them, it was only dust from the machinery of medical procedure. The real difference lay not in the supplies themselves, but in who had the power to decide what counted as waste. That night she slept very lightly. When the lights went out, her thoughts grew sharper. She knew she could never return to her old habit of unconditional frugality, not because she no longer wished to save, but because she had finally grasped something. That frugality is not a virtue, it is evidence of poverty. And poverty slowly teaches a society to distribute dignity in the harshest possible way. The next day, she volunteered to assist with more medical work. She wanted to see more of the procedures, to understand why this system could keep running. She watched nurses log numbers every time they finished using disinfectant, saw the medical officer tally up the daily consumption of supplies, saw logistics soldiers replenish stock by batch. There was no miracle here, no particularly noble human kindness, only a structure holding everything up, making basic medical care a right granted to everyone. For the first time, she realized that institutions are more reliable than feelings. That realization began to change her. She no longer secretly retrieved discarded bandage scraps, no longer felt a stab of pain at what looked like waste. She began to accept that in a system where there is no shortage, what matters most is not saving materials, but following procedure. Procedure ensures safety, safety ensures treatment, and treatment allows people to continue living with their bodies as intact as possible. Her shoulders loosened, her movements grew more natural. At night, she helped the nurses sort instruments and gradually learned to distinguish the sizes and uses of different gauze pads and bandages. She even began writing down some of the American procedures in her diary in German. In that diary, there was one sentence she wrote with particular emphasis. Cleanliness itself is a form of dignity. Spring had not truly arrived yet, but the earth outside the prisoner of war camp was already starting to soften. On the distant road, American trucks still went back and forth in steady rhythm, carrying supplies, wounded men, mail, and reports from place to place. Anneliese gradually realized that those wheels were not turning for the war itself, but for the maintenance of this web of medical stations and evacuation routes. The front could be chaotic, but the rear system could not. The lines at the front could break, but the chain of support behind them had to remain intact. She understood for the first time that order was not a slogan, but a force that could literally decide who lived. And just as she was beginning to settle into that rhythm, an incident tore open a part of her that had not yet healed. One evening, a group of lightly wounded American soldiers were brought in temporarily from the front. Among them was a young man with a through-and-through wound in his shoulder, carried into the medical tent on a stretcher. His uniform was torn and blood-stained, his face pale, but he was still conscious. The wound was deep and bleeding heavily. It needed immediate treatment. Inside the tent, the staff were briefly short-handed, and Nurse Alice called out, "Who can come and help?" Anneliese happened to be nearby and froze for an instant. She heard her own footsteps approaching, soft yet sounding as if they were crossing a boundary line. McCarthy was preparing to cut open the soldier's tunic. When he saw her, he simply nodded, without the slightest hint of doubt. He had grown used to her presence here, used to treating her as someone who could share responsibility, not just as an enemy prisoner. The soldier's breathing was quick, his hands clenched the sides of the stretcher. Blood flowed fast, and the air was thick with the mixed smells of iron and antiseptic, sharp enough to sting the eyes. "Press here," McCarthy told her. She pulled on her gloves and pressed around the wound. The blood throbbed against her fingers, a signal of life still struggling to hold on. McCarthy cleaned the wound swiftly and readied his instruments to begin stitching. Then he turned to fetch a bandage, only to find that the cabinet held just one narrow emergency roll left. Thinner, smaller, enough only for temporary pressure, not for a proper final dressing. Anneliese's heart clenched. Her first reflex was not to wonder whether the Americans had enough supplies, but to recall, almost physically, how in the German hospital, not enough bandages meant that a patient's life might be pushed to a lower priority, left waiting, perhaps quietly abandoned. She expected McCarthy to grow anxious, to call for someone to fetch a fresh roll from storage, to break protocol. He did not. He simply reached out and opened a box on the other side of the tent, the one marked with a red cross that she had noticed many times before, the box reserved for treating prisoner-of-war casualties. Inside, 2 brand-new rolls of bandage lay in perfect order. McCarthy took one out and set it on the tray, opening it with a motion completely free of hesitation. That roll of bandage was for prisoners. It was also for the enemy, and at this moment it was being used to save one of his own soldiers. The scene cut across her chest like a blade of cold light. She wanted to stop him, but did not know what she was trying to stop. Her mind was packed with a contradiction she could hardly bear. In the world she had grown up in, supplies were allocated according to identity, cloth strips distributed according to perceived value, and who received treatment was decided by politics, not by procedure. Here, procedure decided everything. The roll of bandage came out of the prisoner's box and went on to the American soldier's shoulder, and no one saw anything wrong with it. Life mattered more than nationality. That was the first time she had seen this logic practiced before her eyes instead of written on paper. Her chest felt tight, as if crushed beneath a truth she had never encountered. Beneath her gloves, the wound pulsed warm and alive, and to her the air of the entire tent suddenly grew unbearably heavy. Sometimes, hatred is not defeated by argument, but by being quietly ignored. The suturing took only a few minutes. McCarthy's hands were quick and steady, the bandage winding around and around, so white it almost hurt to look at. She watched that whiteness slowly cover the blood, like a symbolic overwriting, two lives from opposing sides joined imperceptibly by the same roll of cloth. "All done," McCarthy said softly. The soldier nodded faintly and sank back onto the stretcher in exhaustion. Anneliese slowly lifted her hands away, her breathing in disarray. She glanced at the now empty prisoner medical box, then at the clean layers of bandage on the soldier's shoulder. Her eyes filled with a complexity beyond words. In her own language, she had often heard a saying, "War was to ensure that our people lived and their people fell." Now one of their people had survived, and the bandage on him had been meant for their enemies. This was not morality. It was policy. Policy is colder than taking sides, but also more even-handed. That night she could not sleep for a long time. The barracks lights were dim, her companion's breathing steady, yet it was as if someone had opened a fissure in her mind. She realized that her earlier fear of touching the bandage had come from its whiteness being too pure, too much like a color that belonged only to victors. Now she understood that it belonged, in fact, to every wound, to anyone who was bleeding and in need of help. The next day, as she checked the medical chests, she fixed her gaze on roll after roll of bandage and did not flinch. She inspected them one by one, smoothing their edges, recording their batch numbers on the forms. Her movements treated them as something precious, but not because they were rare, because of what they meant. The bandage was no longer just cloth, no longer just a resource. It had become a narrow but tangible lifeline. When the afternoon sun streamed through a seam in the tent, she suddenly understood that she had crossed a boundary from which there was no return. The line between enemy and kin would no longer be drawn by uniforms, but by wounds. The order to repatriate arrived sooner than expected. One morning near the end of spring, the holding camp came fully awake. Prisoners were assembled by number, registered, counted, and moved toward the border like a receding tide. As the trucks pulled away, she looked back once at the medical tents, the white bandages, the orderly trays, the steady system slowly receding. She realized that those days had not been the kindness of an enemy, but a stable world she had never possessed. The strength of a state could make even the most ordinary person be treated as a human being. When she returned to Germany, the land had been blasted into broken terraces. Houses lay in ruins, the streets filled with hunger and silence. In the makeshift clinics, she saw familiar smells again, old strips of cloth, too little alcohol, congealed blood scraped away with improvised tools. Fragments of war still floated in the air, and the order she had seen in the American camp was nowhere to be found here. She understood. Identical wounds in different countries were destined for different fates. In those chaotic years, she chose to become a nurse. The clinic lacked supplies, bandages were still scarce. Strips of cloth still had to be boiled and reused, as she had done countless times before the war's end. But her movements had changed. She no longer measured each piece of fabric by how much could be saved, but by whether it could truly keep someone alive. On every wound she tended, she no longer saw friend and foe, only the bare symmetry of human lives. The short strip of bandage she had brought back lay in the deepest drawer of her clinic. It had no use, could never be applied again, yet she never threw it away. Whenever she bandaged a patient under the weak lamp and pulled the cloth tight, she thought of that day, when an American doctor unrolled a length of spotless bandage, and she had pulled her hand back because she could not believe an enemy would place cleanliness in her palm. That was the first time she understood that the lines of war are not carved into skin but etched into systems, and systems decide whether a person is respected or consumed. Years later, as a new Germany slowly rose and supplies became more plentiful, the clinic finally received rolls of white bandage of its own. Sometimes she would open that drawer and look at the strip of gauze she had once not dared to take. It had yellowed slightly, but its texture remained as it had been. Light, soft, clean. She realized that the piece of cloth had never symbolized America, nor defeat. It symbolized another possibility. When a society is willing to offer basic cleanliness to those with the least status, it is also offering a future. Sometimes what an enemy gives you is not forgiveness, but a mirror. And in that mirror she had seen a self that war could not take from her. Through the long post-war years, she bandaged hundreds and hundreds of wounded people. She found that no matter which side they once belonged to, in the end, they all showed the same expression: fear, hope, and the desire to go on living. And she finally understood that what her hands wound round and round was not only bandage, but the world's simplest and hardest belief. Wounds do not distinguish. People ought to be treated as human. That short strip of bandage always lay in the drawer like a silent memorial. It memorialized a war, the lives delayed and broken by it, and the moment when she was first treated by an enemy not as a number, but as a patient. That moment changed her, and changed the way she looked at the world. And she knew that no matter how nations fractured, governments fell, or wars repeated, as long as someone was still willing to place a clean roll of gauze into another's hand, humanity had not entirely failed.